Technically True by Tanay Pant. Hello everyone. Welcome to the fourth episode of Technically True. My name is Tanay Pant and I'm your host. In this episode, we will learn about the art of designing a workshop as well as optimizing its design for better engagement. Today I'm joined by the one and only Joe Nash.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Joe is an award-winning expert in developer communities, previously helping developers at companies like GitHub and PayPal. He's a strong believer in the educational benefits of hacker culture and supports student hackers through both his professional work and community leadership. However, the next time you meet Joe, do not ask him to read time from analog clocks. A very warm welcome, Joe. Would you like to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, I have previously focused on developer communities at developer-facing companies such as GitHub and PayPal. I'm currently a consultant with my own company called Interactive, and I'm continuing that work of working with developers for helping companies build what I call mutual benefit communities. So, as you said with the hackathon piece, a big focus of my work is education, which I believe is going to be the topic of what we're talking about today.
Awesome. So how about we do a quick rapid fire question round to get to know you a bit better? What do you say?
Yeah, perfect. Sounds good.
All right, here we go. Favorite tool to prepare your slides?
Oh, I'm a Keynote fan.
Your favorite speaker?
Oh, see, I don't want to cheat, but I'm a massive fan of Jess Rose. Oh God, Brian Douglas at GitHub, developer advocate at GitHub, is also very, very good.
Favorite city to speak in?
Oh, I mean, I love everything about London. And London is the town I kind of started out as a developer advocate. So I have a lot of fondness for a lot of the communities in London.
Meetups or conferences?
Meetups. I prefer the smaller crowds for sure.
Favorite meetup?
Oh, that's been a while. There was a meetup that used to happen in London. I don't know if it still happens, but it was run by Jen out of the EF office, and it was called Coding and Cake, I believe. And it was literally just a chill evening meetup where everyone brought a cake and a project to work on, and we just hung out on the Entrepreneur First rooftop, eating cake and coding. It was awesome.
That sounds lovely. Your filler word?
I think I vary. Like is definitely one that I use a lot. And as I just did, yeah, it definitely depends what level of jet lag I'm at. They become less words and more grunts the more tired I am.
Right. And the last one, topic that you're most passionate about?
I would definitely say it's an education adjacent topic, but maybe not like directly relevant to actual educating. And it's something more aimed at developer relations people. And that is this concept of mutual benefit, like the fact that developers now, communities of developers around our products aren't just there to be our customer bases, that they have something to gain from engaging with us beyond like use of our product, and that we should make sure that when we're engaging in community activities, we're giving them more than whatever it is we need them to convert to a sale.
Right. Amazing. So, Joe, how did you get started with giving talks and workshops?
Yeah, great question. I was a student at University of Nottingham in the UK, and I was studying computer science. And through that, I discovered hackathons. At the time when I got into hackathons in the UK, there wasn't very many student hackathons. So we started going to a lot of the professional hackathons. And at those hackathons, we, of course, encountered lots of developer advocates and developer evangelists. In particular, I encountered people like Jess Rose, now at Mozilla. I encountered people like Cristiano Betta, who at the time was at PayPal, now he's at Box. And throughout time, I just kind of got like more and more fascinated in what it was they did. And eventually I was competing in PayPal's hackathon, and I was like, this is the best hackathon I've ever been to. How do I work on your team? And after a couple of months, I managed to weasel my way into an internship as a developer advocate intern. And then I just never left. They kept me on, and that was the start of my developer relations career, basically. So yeah, it was very much through hackathons and through that discovering developer advocacy, and then like getting onto a team where they wanted to pay me for my opinions, which was really neat. A lot of my talks at that time, obviously being PayPal, were fintech focused, but PayPal, we had a both regional division, but then we also tried to have someone focused on different language ecosystems. And I was primarily focused on students, obviously being a recent student myself, but also on functional programming because I was big into Haskell in school. So I was doing a lot of talks around it was kind of the time where JavaScript in Haskell was just kind of kicking off, and like things like Elm were just coming on the scene. So I
Mhm.
was doing a lot of talks around a lot of talks to web people about like the things that type systems could bring to their programming. And I stopped doing that just before TypeScript became a big deal. So I kind of missed the wave. But yeah.
Right. Cool. That's really inspiring. In the last episode with Christina Schneider, I mentioned the Mozilla Tech Speakers Program and the speaker feedback sessions that we had in September. So
Mm.
Joe was also one of the mentors there, and that's how we first got acquainted.
Yeah, it was a wonderful day. It was really cool to see all of everyone's lightning talks and to get to meet. I've been familiar with tech speakers for a while because my program
Mhm.
at GitHub was kind of adjacent, and me and Harvey
Right.
had some like conversations about ways they could overlap. And yeah, it was awesome to actually see it all in action. Really inspiring.
Yeah. So usually it goes like this for most people. You learn something new, you get excited by it, so you want to share it with other people. You write up a proposal, you get accepted, and now you have to teach 30 to 40 people. Like, gosh, what was I thinking, right? So what should be the first step to start the preparation for this?
So when we're talking about giving workshops or teaching someone, it's super important to actually have a good grasp of what it is they're going to learn and to
Hmm.
communicate that to them so they can provide their own benchmarks so they know whether they've valued, whether they've got what they should have got from the workshop. So we should set learning objectives. Usually we recommend 3 to 4 learning objectives, and they should be pretty short and concise and deal with one thing at a time. So we don't want, for example, say you're giving a Node.js workshop,
Hmm.
a bad learning, well, an example of a less than optimal learning objective would be by the end of this workshop, you will understand Node.js, right? Because like the
Right.
concept of understanding an entire language ecosystem in one like 1 hour session is very broad indeed.
Yeah.
So it's better to decompose those learning objectives down into manageable bite-sized chunks that follow on from one another. And they don't all have to be the same kind of format. So a really common one is like, by the end of this workshop, you will understand.
Hmm.
But they can also be practical things like you will have built or performed or read or something like
Right.
that. And they can also be preparation for the future, like you will be ready to.
Hmm.
I definitely recommend varying them up a little bit and kind of having that progression from like, you will understand something, you will have used that
Hmm.
understanding to build something, and you will now be ready for the next step.
Right. So setting expectations is quite crucial.
Absolutely. Yeah. Especially in a workshop setting where even in a small class, you're going to have a variation in the level of people who come to that workshop and what knowledge they already have, or what learning style they're bringing to the room. Um, Setting some, like I said, expectations is the perfect word. Having them know what they're going to be gaining and being able to actually assess if they've gained it, so that they know whether to ask more questions, or they know whether to ask more resources, or they know whether to come to that workshop again, is really, really important for their progress.
Right. And when you get started with a workshop and actually running it, how do you break the ice with the participants in a workshop?
Oh, cool question. I am a pretty big fan of, so like I come from like hackathon scene, right? And
Hmm.
in the student hackathon scene in particular, we're big fans of cheesy icebreakers. So Major League Hacking, an organization which I do quite a lot of work with, they do this icebreaker at a lot of their events, which is basically bingo, but they will like seed this bingo sheet with like facts that they know about the attendees in the room, or like things that they expect people in the qualities they expect people in the room will have. And they
Right.
will give those sheets out to everyone and ask them to, basically the aim of the game is to get other people to sign your sheet.
Hmm.
So like, for example, one of the questions might be, has been to more than 5 hackathons, and you have to find someone, engage them in conversation, find out
Uh-huh.
which of the items on their sheet they've got, and if they've been to more than 5 hackathons, they sign that box in your sheet. So I'm a huge fan of these kind of exercises. I think
Hmm.
for some audiences in certain professional settings, there is always a fear of being too juvenile, but I think
Hmm.
I've always had a relatively good reaction in a setting like a workshop to something a little bit more hands-on engaged. And I think the energy of getting people up out of their seats and moving around the room is
Hmm.
really important, especially in a longer workshop where they might be sat behind their laptops for an hour or so. Getting people, like getting that initial movement, I think is really useful.
Right. One of my favorite icebreakers is, I think I borrowed that from the Tech Speakers program,
Yeah.
is to request people to stand up, and it's called something like the open source movement. And so you
Okay.
basically ask people to put their hands up and reach out to the open source streams, reach
Oh,
down,
that's amazing.
connect to the grassroots. Then you kind of move from side to side and say you are blowing the winds of change.
Oh, I
And
love everything about this.
right, and it's really cool. And then you put your hand in front of you, both your hands, as if you're hugging a tree, and like shake that money tree for fundraising.
Oh,
And
that's
then
incredible.
it ends with kind of lean left to avoid the NSA, lean right to avoid the, depends on where you are, probably FSB or
Of
some other
course, yeah.
organization.
Regional agencies.
Yeah. And
Where
yeah,
did you pick this up?
I think it was, so when I was in the Tech Speakers program, we had these master classes from Jen Simmons and different people. So it basically, they had a class about engaging people. And one of the mentors
Hmm.
there told us about it. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name. But yeah, I borrowed that, and it gives good results. There's people laughing, clapping, and
For
gets them,
sure.
especially if a talk is after or workshop is after lunch. I think it's good to
Yeah.
energize them.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting actually talking about expectations and that I think
Yeah,
that's an exercise that completely subverts them in that like people are used to the whole like, oh let's stand up and stretch and then like with
right.
the verbal routine you give it, it completely flips that over. That's really good.
Exactly. Yeah, because if we get this kind of routine from speakers and you just like, stand up, put your hands up, down, that kind of gets maybe a bit annoying for the audience. But if you kind of put a technical spin to it, sure to get some laughs or smiles on that.
For sure, for sure.
In the last podcast, another thing that we talked about was pain, dream, fix, and performance framework very briefly, and how effective it
Yeah.
can be for writing CFPs. And I actually heard about this framework from you in Amsterdam. So
Mhm.
can you tell us how this can be useful in a workshop setting?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing I want to call out is I first encountered the Pain Dream Fix framework from the director of the education team at GitHub, Vanessa Generelli, um, who also the framework that we're kind of talking about this workshop framework, designing for understanding, is also from her. But yes, she got it from a pair of I guess creatives in Philadelphia, Amy Hoy and Alex Hillman, who run this amazing course called 30 by 500. And this is a course for basically like people who have been doing consulting primarily in tech who want to move away from like the hourly race and charging by the hour to like something that actually scales and is like more sustainable. So basically they want to transition from consulting to a product.
Mhm.
And in doing that, like a really important thing is like actually being able to describe what you do and sell what you do, which a lot of people, especially developers, are intrinsically wary of. So they have this framework for writing copy because like copy is so important, especially when you're selling small products and being able to write copy, called Pain Dream Fix. And I learned it in that context, in that copywriting context, and have
Mhm.
since found that basically any text, anything you want to sell, whether that's a CFP to a conference or a product on a web page, this framework is incredible. So the essential principle of it is when you're writing text to capture someone's imagination, the easiest way to get someone interested and engaged in that text is to relate to them a pain that they are familiar with, right? So if we're talking like CFPs, obviously we might be submitting like a technical CFP to a conference. So again, if we're like talking about like a particular framework that achieves something, you might say like, wouldn't it be nice if like you could develop web apps without this problem? And then like so you've given them the pain, and then from there you want to stretch to the dream. So very much like your opening exercise you just said, it's like, so this is where we are now, this is what hurts, what is the
Right.
ideal state, like what is web dev nirvana, that's where we want to be. So then you present them the dream, and
Mhm.
then from there it's like it's the fix, which is what is the thing that moves them from the pain to the dream. And that's when you bring in like what you're actually going to give them. So again, in this like web dev sample, like the pain would be something in web development that sucks. The dream would be life without that pain, and the
Right.
fix would be your magical framework or library that would get them between the two.
Mhm.
And this works really well for CFPs because another framework that works really well for CFPs that is like kind of related is like setting the context. It's like where is the thing that you're teaching occurring, kind of telling them how to like solve the problem, and then kind of saying what audience it's for. And this is like a very similar framework in that it gives you 3 quick sentences, maybe like 6 sentences maximum.
Mhm.
Everyone can read it, relate to it, they can see what the problem is, they can see where like what the end state is, and they know exactly how you're going to get them there.
Interesting. What I've often seen is there are workshops which really differ from each other in terms of time
Right.
frame. So I've seen workshops running for an hour, 3 hours, and even full day workshops. So keeping in mind things like knowledge retention, attention span, and so on, what's your opinion of
Sure.
a good time frame for a workshop?
Yeah, great question. I think longer workshops definitely have their place, but I think again, like I said, the attention span and the just natural endurance of humans and ability to retain information needs to be taken into account. So I would say, like, even when you're talking long day workshops, you're not actually talking
Mhm.
one workshop, you're talking about a series of discrete engagements, right? So if we talk about an hour workshop, we might be talking literally about students come in, you give them the learning objectives, you teach them something for half an hour, they then like apply that learning themselves to a project for half an hour, and then you're done. Whereas if you're talking a day long workshop,
Mhm.
you're going to want to vary those activities. There's going to be breaks. You're going to have, for example, a traditional, maybe like lecture kind of talking to them session in the morning for an hour when they're ready to like absorb information, and then bounce out to a discussion around lunchtime so that they can break and go to lunch and continue that discussion at their tables. And then when they come back from lunch, they're going to be full of carbs and sleepy. So you want to
Mhm.
do something a bit more relaxed that requires less of the brain whilst
Right.
that process works itself out. And then in the afternoon, you can kind of get around to like feeding back and maybe applying something in a relatively straightforward way. So it's definitely a whole different process in how you go about planning that and accommodating for like the energy levels throughout the day. But it gives you a
Mhm.
lot more scope and ability to accommodate those different learning styles, right? Like in a 1 hour workshop, you're very limited in how many different techniques you can apply because otherwise you just run out of time. But a whole
Right.
day, you can bring in all the goodness from like speaking exercises, discussions, like throwing things up on a physical medium like a whiteboard or post-its. You have a whole range of things you can play with.
Right. And so essentially design the workshop depending on the time frame that you have.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. I don't think you. I think very much like a conference talk, you can't take an hour long workshop and like snap your fingers and say now this is a day long workshop, right?
Right.
It will never quite fit. You need to approach them with a different mindset and a different set of design constraints. Like when you're in the hour long workshop, obviously there is like pacing you need to deal with, and there is like ebbs and flows and energy and attention you need to deal with, but it's a very different scale to a day or
Right.
even a multi day.
Right. And how do you evaluate the effectiveness of a workshop?
Yeah, so this comes down to like so on the framework that I mentioned earlier, the designing for understanding framework. It has these kind of three components that we talk about. So it's the learning objectives, kind of how we start the workshop, as we said, and
Mhm.
then an assessment, something for the students or the participants to apply the knowledge they've learned to. Um, and then the activities that move you between the learning objectives and the assessment. And it's really that assessment which is the evaluation, right? So by the end of
Mhm.
that workshop, they'll have been presented learning activities at the beginning. They'll have learning objectives at the beginning, sorry. They will have performed some activities in order to learn and to
Right.
capture the content, and then they'll do an assessment. So again, going back to like a coding example,
Mhm.
you might tell them about the principles of the event loop in Node.js, and then at the end of the workshop, like towards the end of the workshop, they'll start applying that by dealing with some asynchronous code in Node.js or something. And it's at that point where you assess the effectiveness, where you look at what they've learned, what they've done, and what we call the performance of understanding. So an assessment is a performance of understanding because they've learned something, they've hopefully understood it, and then they show that they understand it by performing the assessment and
Right.
building something. And then you relate that back to learning objectives. So you walk through that and you're like, cool, you've achieved this thing. During this thing, did you capture these learning objectives? Do you feel like you've done this learning objective? And in that way, you kind of help the students evaluate themselves whether the workshop has been effective for them, right? Because if they holding this object in the hand, this one of the things they've created, and they
Mhm.
can't see the learning objectives in that, then there's been a mismatch somewhere.
Right. Makes sense. And we earlier talked about like icebreakers at the starting of a workshop or a
Mm.
talk. But how do you make sure that the workshop remains interactive and more engaging for the audience during the duration
Mm.
of the workshop? So, sort of like the audience do not get to sleep.
For sure, yeah.
Mhm.
I think that is a common pitfall for folks, especially I think in the more time-strained workshops where people start with a workshop and it ends up being a talk.
Right.
I think just the trick is to vary the mode of teaching continually. So there will always be necessity for some presentation of knowledge, right? Like at some point, as presenting the workshop, you're going to be in front of them, or some content is going to be in front of them, and you're going to be conveying that content to them. And the trick is to analyze, the trick is to get right the size of content that you deliver before you change to applying that or discussing that. So again, like if we go back to like a coding workshop, like how many concepts do you show a student before they turn to applying them to the exercise they're doing, or before they discuss them? A common downfall in coding workshops, kind of to your point about falling asleep, is so many of these switch points where they go from presenting the exercise to like presenting the content to doing the exercise will now be like, okay, cool, now write down the code I've just showed you on the whiteboard in your own terminal. And like that's just completely passive, right? Like you're just looking at something you've been shown and writing it down yourself. And that's where like as many people feel like, I think in coding there's this pressure to always be doing something on the machine, but things like just discussing or questioning what has been shown are more valuable in that retaining attentiveness and like keeping people awake, because it's much more active, and framing a question is a much more difficult task for a human than blindly copying from a board, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I don't know if it's just me, but I feel that workshops are way more challenging to design and run as compared to presenting a talk. And you mentioned that it's also different when you're designing a workshop for different time slots. It's not similar to talks that you can just scale them up or down. So what are some of the things that one should keep in mind as a first-time workshop organizer?
I think, and I've touched on this a little bit already, but the definite thing is like you are teaching and everyone is there to come along on that journey and like meet the learning objectives, and they're going to get there at different paces, and there's going to be friction points that halt people to different degrees, and that's one of the really difficult things to accommodate, especially in a community or in a setting where you're not necessarily familiar with the audience, say a conference, where you don't necessarily know who's going to turn up. You haven't been the one to book those attendees or to like meet them in advance and offer them the workshop. So I think that's definitely the hardest bit, because no matter how much content you plan, you will always end up not delivering it all, because you'll be helping people along the way and you'll have to revisit certain concepts, and that's also totally fine. Yeah, I recommend building workshops with basically some elasticity. So like having, for example, we talk about these exercises like the assessment, the thing that they'll actually build to show they've understood the content. Having those have multiple acceptable finish states is a very good idea. So like, for example, if you're having them build a sample app, maybe it's okay if they just finish up like stages 1, 2, 3, and it's still, they don't necessarily realize they haven't done stages 4, 5, and 6, right? Like finding those natural stopping points and monitoring your workshop as you go and being like, okay, we have 10 minutes left. We're not going to make it all the way to that point, but I can smoothly halt this here, and no one will be any of the wiser that they've missed content, is, I would say, like the best tactic. And then also just in terms of preparing and being ready for that, making sure that you have people in the room to support you. Whilst even with a small workshop of say like 4 or 5 people, if someone needs more help for a stage, or you need to go and deal with an issue or a bug, that pauses the whole workshop for everyone if you're alone, right? So even just having one teaching assistant who is able to nudge people along is really helpful. If you're doing technical workshops, again, a really good way of doing this actually is having recoverable breakpoints. So this was something we spoke about in MozTech Speakers, where, for example, if you are, say you're like walking them through a project or an app, if you throw it up on GitHub and or any Git hosting service of your choice, and you can then do things like using the branches to save the different states of the project. So say like you're walking them through 4 exercises on the project, you can have a branch of step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and then if someone does get like irrecoverably stuck, you can just say to them, not a big deal, just go and pull this other branch, skip straight to the the project step to the next stage, and you can pick up where we are, and you can go back and fix your one later. And so they get to get the rest of the content without being frustrated or stuck at where they were.
Right. I really like your idea about maybe having a teaching assistant or a co-speaker who can just move through the audience and make sure they're able to follow everything through without having to pause for the whole session.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you do bigger workshops like 30 people, you're going to want, in reality, quite a few. And preparing those teaching assistants is in itself a whole set of things. We like giving them the materials that they need in advance so they understand the content and they're prepared with the content and they're prepared for the questions. Is definitely also an important point of preparation for those bigger workshops.
Right. And what are some of the biggest challenges that you have faced while running a workshop?
Oh, one thing that trips me up repeatedly every time, and I can't believe I still make this mistake every time, is not communicating to the organizers of the event that's hosting the workshop to communicate to the attendees that a laptop is required.
Right.
I turned up to a surprising amount of workshops on technical content where the audience hasn't realized they need to bring a laptop completely fairly because they weren't warned in advance. And so I end up with a room full of people who aren't prepared to follow along with the content, and I have to rapidly basically turn it from a workshop into a talk, right? And that has happened an embarrassing amount of times to me. And yeah, as I said, I think the other one is you just never get as far as you think you will, and catching that as it's happening in the moment so that you are able to use that elasticity that you built in is again a really tricky thing. Like I've gone right up until like 5 minutes before the end of the workshop before I've like realized the time, and I've been like, oh no, because obviously when you're speaking, time dilates and ceases to have meaning.
Exactly.
So keeping an eye on the clock is also definitely a difficult sticking point. And yeah, tangents as well. Actually, I think workshops are particularly prone to tangents. You get like a good question from the audience, which of course you often will, and you're in that setting where you're not constrained by your slides. Like you've often got a terminal or a browser in front of you because you're doing things more freeform, and you are able to go on that tangent, and that's great. That's like workshops should be interactive. The participants should drive it with their curiosity, but recognizing when to pull that back is definitely a challenge.
And any specific don'ts that one should be mindful of?
I think a big one common to all content preparation in our industry in general is use of certain language, especially when conveying concepts. A lot of us, and I've done it several times in this podcast actually, have the tendency to accidentally slip in words like obviously or clearly, words that as we're describing something trivialize the problem, and those are filler words as any other, and we don't necessarily mean them in the way that we're using them, but they can have, if picked up on by a person who is not having the best time, they can have a pretty debilitating effect. So I definitely say learning to use a set of speech that's appropriate to a learning context is really important. And then the other big one is a surprising amount of people fall into the trap of signing up for a workshop when actually the content they prepared is a talk.
Right.
I definitely say that like if you're not stopping every 2 to 3 minutes to engage in some kind of content, it's probably veering more towards the talk format. It doesn't always have to be a long time. I'm a big fan of, especially in the really, really large workshops where you can't really have people do meaningful like big projects. I'm a big fan of just like 30-second periods of someone turning to the person next to them and thinking out loud something they're doing. So for example, I did this workshop at HackerCon last year, which is it was a talk, but I turned it into a workshop thanks to Vanessa. It was a talk to like 200 people that I decided would be interactive, and the talk was all about kind of reassessing why people do hackathons and getting back to that community benefit of hackathons. And so there were points in that where we'd frequently have the audience turn to each other and speak out loud things like, I think that my community goes to hackathons because of this, and like give that reason. And then the next exercise would be the person who is listening to them would have to flip that over and tell that person what they heard and how they interpreted that. And even just those small exercises, bring in that interactivity to keep people engaged and get them actively learning rather than just listening, and can be super, super, super important, super useful, even in a technical talk.
And if you say like you are the only one presenting in a workshop, what would be your ideal audience size?
I think if you're the only one, you do need to keep it really small. It also depends what you're presenting, right? So like if you're doing like a hands-on, we're going to learn like a web framework or Kubernetes, whatever it is today. Obviously it needs to go even smaller. But if you're doing something where you are just relying on people talking to each other or thinking or not getting into a terminal, or you're using like a simplified web environment, for example.
Yeah.
When I do Git workshops, I'm a big fan of learn Git branching. .js, I think it's called, which is a really wonderful thing. When using those simplified, it's very, very good. It's a Git branch visualizer that kind of gives you like a sandbox where you can like create complicated Git trees without having to like actually have a product. So if you want to show, for example, like complicated branching or like rebases or whatever, you don't have to like set up a whole project with genuine files and history. You just mash like git commit 8 times and then you can say git branch, and like it cuts out all of the actual file bit and just leaves you with like simulated commits. It's very good.
Very cool.
But anyway, I digress. So when you're in those simplified environments, obviously you can go bigger, but I would say for one person, like the max you want to be at is like 12 to 15, and even that's really pushing it.
Right.
The more complicated your exercise, the smaller you need to bring it.
Sounds good.
I guess actually to kind of like make it formulaic, I would think about like what is the worst state that someone can get in with the project, right? So like if you're talking a coding project, like they could get into a bug that you don't understand, right? And that could pause things for a long time. Whereas if you're talking about like a discussion, they could just like not understand a point, or they might have further clarification, but like it's something that you can advance past pretty quickly, or tell them to hold the question. Whereas, it's so I think about that, like what is the longest you could be delayed by an exercise going wrong, and every 10 minutes that could happen, not like reduce the size of the workshop by like 1 or 2 people.
Right. And what you do in a scenario where maybe a bug occurs in somebody's system while they are following your tutorial, and you don't understand how to fix it. So what would be the best way to salvage that situation?
Sure. So I think first of all, those are really important moments, and they are moments where you get to be a little bit vulnerable with the audience and maybe become a little bit relatable, in that like, I have no idea what's going on here. This is fun. We're all learning together. Let's go to Stack Overflow like all programmers do.
Right.
But yeah, as I said, I think having those breakpoints prepared where you can say to them like, hey, this is a super interesting bug. I have no idea. Let's like bookmark this one and come back to this after the workshop. Like catch me in the break or something and we'll check this out together. But for now, why don't you just clone the project from here and you'll be caught up to where we are. I think that's the ideal tactic.
Awesome. All right. Before we wrap up, are we missing something? Any piece of advice that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Oh, I don't think so. No, it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today, Joe. This was a lot of fun.
It was. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you all for listening to this episode of Technically True. I'm @Tane1337 on Twitter, and I would love to know what you'd like to listen in the next episode. Until then, auf Wiedersehen. You have been listening to Technically True, a podcast about public speaking, developer relations, and technology, hosted and produced by Tane Pan.